So, welcome to Let's Get Graphic, writing for comics and graphic novels with Benjamin A. Wilgus tonight at the Hackettstown Free Public Library. Well, I guess via Zoom, not at the library.
I'm there in spirit.
Well, we didn't want you to have to get on the train for that long. Um, but this is part of our Art and Craft of Writing series, and it's sponsored by the Warren County Cultural and Heritage Division. So thank you very much for that. So a brief bio about Ben. Ben is a cartoonist and writer of comics and prose, including Chronin, a graphic novel duology published by Tor Books. He both wrote and illustrated. His middle grade graphic novel, Grace Needs Space, illustrated by, I'm going to get this wrong, is it?
Rii Abrego.
Say it again.
Rii Abrego.
Rii Abrego. I didn't know if it was Rii or not. Was just published by Random House Graphic. Well, that was a while ago, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's April. That's still in publishing. That counts as just.
True. In his capacity as a freelance editor with First Second Books, Ben is the lead developmental editor on a number of titles, working closely with authors to shepherd their books from outline to print. His editorial work includes Bubble and the #1 New York Times bestselling series, The Adventure Zone. He's also the co-host of Graphic Novel TK, a podcast that details the nuts and bolts of graphic novel publishing. Ben graduated from New York University's Tisch School for the Arts and lives in Brooklyn, New York. So take it away.
All of that is still accurate. I gave you that bio a while ago. I do still live in Brooklyn. I did still get NYU. I did make all those books. So there we go.
All right, I'm going to step back now.
Okay, so this is I do have notes for this. I can be a little informal in how I talk about these things, but I think it's more fun that way. So yeah, I want to talk about graphic novel writing and comics writing. I will say I did laugh when I saw the title of this presentation. I want to stress everything here will be safe for work. This is I think teens and up. I think there's some swears in there. But this is a pretty low key panel as it goes. So I'm gonna kind of let's see here. Whoop. There we go. So here's the thing. I've been to a lot of talks about comics writing back when I first started working in publishing and working in comics. I did that thing where I went to a lot of panels with other people talking about my job, which is extremely neurodivergent of me. But I just thought it was really interesting to hear how other people were thinking about it. And so I'd not only hear how other people would talk about, but also the kinds of questions that people would ask. And I myself have given a decent number of talks about comics writing over the years. And usually when people want to ask me about comics writing, what they're kind of asking me is basically this. They're like, what does a script look like? How do you write a comic script? Like, is there a standard way of doing it? Because maybe they read something about Marvel comics and there's like kind of a very specific script format for Marvel comics, and they want to know if all comics are like that. So it is worth saying, for one thing, there is no standard comic script. There is, for instance, in prose, there's something called like standard manuscript format that, like, if you submit your book to publishers, there's a way that they expect it to be formatted. That is not true for comics. We're kind of a wild bunch of folks, do things in all kinds of different ways, but usually it's something like this. And the most important thing is that, and this is a trend kind of throughout the entire comics process, it's all about communication. You're not only communicating with your reader at the end of the day, you're also communicating with your collaborators, because most comics are collaborative. Comics is a very collaborative medium. So here what you have is the important elements here is you have the page number that you're writing, you have the panel number. Most comics pages have between 1 and 6 panels on them. Once you start to get too far past 6 panels, it can get a little dicey, especially for kids comics where the lettering tends to be bigger. And you'll see a character name, then a colon, and their dialogue. I also picked a page that had some sound effects on it. So when I wrote this comic, this from my own comic, Grace Needs Space, and when I wrote this comic, I wrote it's on the left, and I then gave it to my collaborator, the fabulous Rii Abrego, and she drew what's on the right. To be clear, there are various versions of this page before this beautiful, completely finished, full color page that you're looking at, but this is the end product from the script. This is basically, when people think about comics writing, this is what they're thinking of, right? And these things are all really important. Like there's 4 panels, the characters are talking to each other, there's some sound effects. You can also see them also describing the action of what they're doing here. I say Grace lays her face down on the cool surface of the table. Kendra tears the package open. That is in fact what's happening in panel 3. It's all very straightforward. This is the only really straightforward panel of this entire presentation, because while I think all this stuff is really important, I think a lot of it's also pretty obvious and pretty intuitive. So I want to talk a little bit more about what makes comics writing kind of different from other kinds of writing you might have done, and also what makes comics as a medium different than other mediums. Comics gets compared a lot to both film and also prose in different ways, and those are both apt, but they're neither one of them work quite the way that comics does. So, for instance, here's another spread from Grace Needs Space. You'll notice that you have there's a spiky balloon here that's to imply that it's an announcement instead of somebody talking on the page. You've got your dialogue here, but also notice that there's actually very little dialogue on this page. So what's happening in the scene is that Grace is on a space elevator that's taking her from the orbit of a moon of Saturn down to the surface. So it's far in the future. So the space elevator is like riding on an airplane, right? A lot of people do it. So as you can see, she's kind of in a seat with a seatbelt on it. She's waiting for something, and you've been on an airplane, so you might most of you, so you'll recognize the classic "fasten your seatbelt" sign. And so one of the most important pieces of information on this page is the indication that they are now finished with their descent and Grace can stand up. So there's two different ways in which this is why I did it this way. One, because I think it reminds you, this grounds you, and this is actually a very mundane experience for her. She's excited about this, but lots of people go on this kind of thing all the time. It's very user friendly. This isn't like a space shuttle landing. This is a very standard thing people do all the time. But also, I'm going to tell you, as an artist, it's actually very hard to draw certain kinds of things in a way that's clear, and things like unfastened seatbelt and stands up, it's actually kind of a hard thing to draw where it's really clear that that's what's happened. So also having that graphic on the screen that makes it very clear, all these pieces of information are helping you, the reader, be able to understand what the important actions are and what's happening, right? And all of that is in the script, to be clear. Rii did an amazing job drawing it, but I also described all of these individual elements in the script when I was writing it, because for me, part of writing, and this is, to be clear, if you're writing a comic for somebody else, this is your job. Anything that's important for the reader to understand should be in the comic script in some way. And there's different ways of explaining it, but you should be explaining it. So here's another example of a page that doesn't have a ton of dialogue on it. This is interesting because there's visual information going on here, and there's also dialogue information going on here. And while the previous thing was about how the visual information and the different elements of the thing were all kind of complementing each other, here's an example of when they're contrasting each other. Because what's literally happening on the screen here is Grace has gotten locked in a room she's not supposed to be in overnight, and she's found an intercom and she presses the button. So the dialogue is pretty straightforward. She's like, hey, I can you let me in? I'm stuck. I got left behind. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, we'll absolutely let you in. And if that was just the dialogue, you'd be like, oh, these nice people helped her out, because you can see it. You can also see these two people inside of the room being like, oh my God, we locked a child. We locked a child in the room. Oh my God. And she's running to go get her. And they're trying to be calm because she's a scared kid. And so the dialogue is actually pretty calm, but the visuals are giving you information that the dialogue is not giving you. And then here's another page where there's no dialogue at all. And this is a very important moment in this comic, is then because there's been a lot of tension between Grace and her mom here throughout the course of this book. This is toward the end of the book. They've been fighting. They've had a hard time. But at the end of this comic, when they're ending their adventure together, there's this moment where they're kind of connecting in this very nice family way. It's very clear if you're looking at this, what's important here and what these characters are feeling. But again, there's no dialogue here. And I want to show pages like this because I think that there's this sense that what comics writing is basically I'm writing dialogue and then I'm describing what the characters are doing while that dialogue happens. And that certainly is a big part of comics writing. But sometimes the most important job that you're doing as a writer is actually describing something in a way that you're communicating to the artist that you're working with what is happening on this page and what it means, so that the artist can then accurately capture that and add their own perspective and their own flavor to that, so the reader can have the emotional experience and get the information you're trying to communicate on the actual page. So now moving on to some other people's comics. This is from a comic that I edited, Adventure Zone: The 11th Hour, which is the 5th book in the Adventure Zone series. And this I kind of wanted to pull this page out because another thing that happens in comics is just like in any other kind of medium, there are conventions, there's ways things tend to work, there's shortcuts people tend to take, And in this one, there's two different things on this page that, for instance, I thought were interesting to give you a sense of like the vocabulary of comics. So on the third panel, so what's happening at the beginning, first couple of panels is one character's explaining to the others, like she's beginning to give them the setup. They're about to get dispatched on their adventure for the rest of this book, and she's giving them kind of background information on what they're about to do. And so they've started in one room and they're moving to another place. So in the first two panels, they're in the first room. And then in the third panel, you see that you have this much broader shot of the larger landscape that they're all in. This is like a type of transition panel where it both smooths over the scene transition and makes it clear to the reader. You're visually telling them they were in one place before, now they're going to be in a different place, so that it isn't jarring, they kind of understand. It also lets you skip a little time, so you don't have to show them like opening the door and then walking in the hallway and then walking out of the building. Like, it's a very clean way to sort of go from one place to another place and then having some dialogue over it. Whoop. Max, you must mute yourself. Thank you. Sorry to call you out, Max. And then so the little bit of dialogue helps smooth the transition over. And then another thing I wanted to point out on this page, in the last panel, she says because of this, and she's hitting a button on her wrist bracer there. And this is a very common thing that happens in comics, and I think a really great one, which is the importance of the page turn, because you have to remember comics are a physical object in addition to being like a thing that you're reading. Even if you're reading them digitally, you're gonna be reading it one page at a time, right? And so for the most part, if you're, for instance, looking at a comic, this page would have been on the right side of this spread. So you have to physically turn the page to see what happens. And a piece of advice that I got actually from my first boss a million years ago, when I was working in animation, what he told me is that like a thing to be keeping in mind when you're writing comics is that somebody should have a reason to turn the page every single time. And like you can get a little carried away with that, but it's something to be keeping in mind about where you're putting your page breaks. So here it's like the end of this page, every page should be is like a little cliffhanger, right? It's like a little bit of, oh, what's going to happen next? And so here's like a really great example of a very kind of, this is the quiet version of that, but it's still, you want to answer the question. What is she going to show them? Let's see here. Sorry. And then this is another example of like kind of you tend to see a lot of comics like this. And I want to stress, something being really common doesn't mean it's bad. You don't have to reinvent the wheel especially if you're new to comics. It's okay to do things in a really standard way. This is a very standard thing, whereas like you're setting the scene. You see this in manga a lot. A lot of Western comics people do this now, but this is traditionally a manga thing, wherein you show a lot of individual parts of a given scene in order to give you a sense of the whole scene that you've just entered. And one thing I specifically want to mention about this is that if you're writing a comic for somebody else, particularly if you have a very clear sense in your mind about what the scene should look like, and it's an important scene, or especially if it's a real place, in my opinion, both as a writer and as an editor, it is the author's responsibility, like the writer's responsibility, to provide reference information and material to your artist. Like when I write a book, I usually also send them a link to like this huge Dropbox folder that has nested folders that are organized either by scene or by like location or by chapter, depending on the nature of the book. And the more technical something is, or the more specific something is, the more I will give them, because when I'm writing this, have a very clear picture in my mind or very specific thing that I'm referencing, and it's going to turn out better if I provide that material to the artist. So now I'm going to get into into some weirder stuff here, because I want to kind of show some of the ways in which you can do things in comics that work differently than prose.
How weird
that are really cool, right? So in this scene, this is from a comic called Bubble. This scene, one of the characters has done some substances, done some drugs, and this is a way of showing the subjective experience of that character in this particular scene. And here's the thing. When you're reading a prose book, we're really used to subjectivity. Most prose books are written in what is called limited third person, or else the first person. Like most of them are like, I'm in a particular person's point of view. Sometimes there's multiple character points of views, but in a given scene, there's usually a particular person's perspective that you're seeing that scene through. And you might think in comics that's harder to do, right? Because because of the way that they're structured, it's less inclined to that. But this is a great way of an example of how you can make it very clear whose perspective a certain scene is happening from, because there's a lot of stuff going on here that is grounding you in the lived experience of this guy who's having a heck of a time. This is also a great example of how you can really play with comics as a medium. Like it, when this had the dialogue on it, it does rotate. Like you had to physically rotate the book to read all the dialogue because it was all oriented with like whatever face it was attached to. And then the colorist, Natalie Reese, like she kind of pushed that feeling even further. So this is sort of example of kind of fun things you can do with comics. This is another example of how you can establish subjectivity in comics. This is like a more, how do I put it? Like a more straightforward, like kind of obvious version of that. In this case, this is also really interesting because you actually swap perspectives. So in the first couple of panels, you're in the perspective of somebody who is approaching the sleeping figure, like very literally, like the scene is getting bigger and bigger as this person is coming closer. And then in the third page, you swap to the other character's perspective, and you're now experiencing this sort of transitional thing where you're still seeing this character from the outside, but you're now focusing in on the part of the scene that they're in. And in the fourth page, you've completely swapped to the literal point of view of that sleeping character as she's now perceiving the person who you started out with, right? So this is very interesting how you're kind of passing the baton of perspective in this particular scene. And here's another thing where it's like, again, another example of point of view. This is even more literal, where like somebody's just woken up, you're looking at this person's hand and limbs from like very direct perspective. You pull back again. So anyway, this is again an example of like a particular person's subjective experience of the scene. And also the thing that's interesting here is that you have elements here where it's not clear if they're really happening or not. Like, is he hallucinating? Is this literally happening? This is just a great example of like fun ways you could kind of play with this. Here's another example of like, again, sorry, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but this is like a very powerful part of comic storytelling. So I really want to like kind of show different ways that different people are doing this. And I understand also these are all very visual, and a lot of people here might not be artists, but like this is the person, if you're working with an artist, they're going to be helping you realize this on the page and having a sense of what can be done, even if you personally don't have the artistic ability to do it, can help you make better choices when you're writing comics. So in this case, something very violent and disorienting has happened to this character. For the record, he's in space. This is a space context, violent, disorienting thing, but he's underwater. It's not great. But the important thing here is that like both the color and the sort of very small focus on particular elements of what's happening is recreating this character's experience of this violent and disorienting thing. The way that light, for instance, kind of is like making things feel very claustrophobic, the way that the focus on individual points of contact, like things that he's touching, impacts that are happening, are like grounding you in like his individual perspective of the thing. If you've ever been in a car crash or had any other kind of thing like this happen, like you become very aware of very specific individual bits and pieces of this thing because it's too much for you to take in at once. This page is trying to recreate that feeling of the disorientation and the claustrophobia of this thing that's happening to him, because he's also in a spacesuit, which kind of adds that element of like being kind of trapped within something that is trapped within something here. There is another way of you're now using both the kind of light and paneling to kind of recreate a very small emotional moment here. This character is having a moment of realizing something very bad has happened. And not only using moment-to-moment storytelling so that you, the reader, can really focus on all the little details of what is changing between these panels, specifically his body language and his facial expression, helps you sort of see if these panels weren't so similar, the changes between them are so subtle you might not necessarily notice them. Because these panels are so similar, you can really see all these little teeny, like the slow moment happen to him. This artist is also using dropping the background away to help express to you like how he's kind of disappearing in his own head in this moment. Even though literally it isn't literally getting darker in this, it's like his subjective experience of this moment. And there's another thing where it's like similar uh techniques for a completely different effect. Again, by having all the panels be very similar to each other, it's this very subtle body language is very hard for you to notice if you aren't limiting. It's kind of like a science experiment where you have to have the control so you can see the way the thing you're actually trying to see. It's a little bit like that in terms of the thing. And specifically, this is from a romance story, and I think this kind of storytelling is extremely useful in any kind of very emotional comic, particularly things like romance, where those little details of how characters are looking at each other and how they're experiencing a moment are really, really important. Um, uh, Here's another example of not only kind of helping you understand a character's subjective experience, but also time. Time in comics is kind of tricky. In prose, you can just write a paragraph that covers a month of somebody's life in a sort of summarizing way. It's You can't do that in comics in quite the same way, and there's different things that different people do in order to compress time, so you're not just like literally slogging through every single moment of a given scene, nor are you jumping around in a way that's really confusing. This particular scene is a very uncomfortable dinner that this woman is having with her boyfriend's family, and these 2-page spread covers the entirety of the of this dinner. And the important information is that she is uncomfortable. Her boyfriend, who's in the upper right of the turtleneck, is ignoring her, and she doesn't feel great about this. So this isn't like a literal like 1 second thing that is happening. This is kind of trying to communicate that like this sort of specific series of moments are helping you understand the larger tone of this entire scene that's happening without you actually having to sit through the entire thing. And again, this is a different style of montage where you're kind of jumping around more in time in order to both literally communicate like some stupid things that are happening, but also communicate this is the thing that happens all the time, if that makes any sense. There's sort of a timelessness to the way that this scene is drawn, particularly because of the narration kind of over it, where it's both this thing specifically happened to this character this one moment, but also because you're a little bit outside of it, because there isn't dialogue on it, it makes it feel timeless, and you kind of subject like subtly get the feeling of like, oh, this isn't just this one time. This is like this is a larger problem. It makes the moment feel bigger, if that makes any sense. And then yeah, this is sort of a thing. I also just want to kind of stress that like you can do a lot of really fun things with comics, and you can get caught up in the sense of like everything having to be very representational and very realistic. But this is a great way of sort of communicating. Like you can have like very intense and emotional and like cool comics that are still very abstract. These character designs are very abstract. This one of the two important characters of the scene literally doesn't have an expressive face, but through body language and paneling and also color and the way that the comic is focusing your attention, you can still, it is very clear what is going on here, and it's very clear how these two characters kind of feel about it. Just kind of neat. It's a neat thing. And again, these are all just sort of the toolbox of things that you can do in comics. So another thing that I really want to talk about here also is that like a thing that gets neglected a lot in conversations about comics is lettering. Lettering is incredibly important. It's often treated like an afterthought in comics making, even by people who should know better, like even by professionals. And so I also wanted to kind of show some examples of when lettering is also not only literally part of the page, like you are looking at it as part of the art. It also can communicate stuff on its own. And it shouldn't always be crazy. Like this is very loud lettering, I guess. Like it's very obvious and you're going to pay very close attention to it. Sometimes lettering kind of should settle into the background, although like choices about font and like balloon style and things are also important, but it can be used as a storytelling element, just like anything else. So in this case, this character is supposed to be very unsettling, also very unnatural, and part of how the artist is communicating the sort of unnaturalness and like wrongness of this monstrous character is by having his dialogue be represented in a way that is wrong. Like, we as people who are comics literate know what comics lettering is supposed to look like. And so this character having his lettering be like inside of his mouth in this weird way, both, I mean, it also looks cool and makes this character more disorienting, but it also sets this character apart from everybody else in the comic with their normal comics lettering as being unnatural, as being outside the natural order of things, which is true. This is important information about the character. The character is in fact monstrous and outside the natural order of things. And other things are in the story are telling you that, but the lettering is part of what's telling you that. And likewise, like in this case, this character is in I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but this is a way of just showing how lettering can be very expressive and add a lot of texture to your page outside of just like sound effects, which I think is what people usually think of when they think of like lettering that isn't as straightforward. All of the lettering on this page is dialogue, but it's being said by different characters that are supposed to have different, and this is a way of kind of the sound design of comics, right? Like all these you can't literally hear this, but you can imagine what these different pieces of dialogue would sound like and what kind of voices would make them and how they are different from each other and which ones are loud and which ones are quiet and which ones the focus would be drawn on and which ones wouldn't. And you can visually communicate that in comics in all kinds of interesting ways. And again, if you're writing this for somebody else, at least some of this should be in your script. If you have a sense of this, you should be describing your intention for this as much as possible. There are ways to describe this kind of thing in a comic script to help communicate that vision to the people that you're working with, even if you're not doing it yourself. Here's a kind of a more silly way in which comics lettering can be fun. This is like just a strip. So it's, very short comics, very colorful, very fun, but you can see, like, again, the way in which these different panels are drawn, some of them have color in them, is helping you get a sense of what the tone of voice is, what the intention is, what the emotion is behind these different things. Like it's both fun to look at, and it is also communicating important information about like the feeling of, it's part of the acting. It isn't just like the facial expression these characters are making. The dialogue isn't just the content of the dialogue. It is how it is drawn and how it is colored is part of the acting of this comic, which again, I think is really cool. And here's a different example of that same artist. And this is kind of transitioning into another thing. You'll also see that a lot of the color in this section is what I would call like non-representational. Like the comic doesn't literally have a pink background. They don't literally become yellow in panel 2. Like, you kind of intuitively understand this. Like, this is sort of meant to communicate the intensity of that moment in one way or another. And I think that comics coloring is actually really hard. I am not a very good colorist. I never have been. I have a ton of respect for colorists. But one way in which there's two different ways that comics can look amateurish, even if the art is otherwise very good. And one way is when the lettering is bad or ill-conceived or doesn't fit the art. And another way is when the color is too literal and too representational. A lot of the time that is part of what makes a comic feel less professional looking and or can make it feel younger, which especially if you're making comics for older readers, like that isn't great. So that said, here's an example from the same artists drawing a very different type of comic in which you can see like they are very capable of coloring these very beautiful and more kind of realistically colored things, but a lot of the time they're using color to communicate emotion, time of day, to emphasize one moment as being important in one way, to add energy to that moment. I'd like, honestly, it's helpful to think of color for comics as being kind of like the musical score for a film. It is helping set the tone. Like, you're not usually like consciously thinking about the score when you're watching a film, unless it's like doing something really aggressive to manipulate you or it's very loud. But it is kind of subtly influencing the mood and like your experience of a scene in addition to everything else that's happening. And color works the same way for comics. You can do a lot of really cool stuff with color. And again, like, obviously if you're working with an artist, you're not going to want to micromanage every single choice that they're making, but you could, for instance, say something like, this one panel should be colored in a very loud way, or this scene is very sad, maybe use like muted tones, or this is happening in the late afternoon and I want to have that golden hour feel to it. Like, that's another thing you should be thinking about. And you don't want to micromanage an artist that you're working with, but like when it's important or when you have a really clear idea of it, this is other things you kind of help communicate the story that you're trying to tell. So all of that said, I am gonna talk a little bit more about the more practical stuff kind of at the end of here. Like what actually comics writing looks on the thing, but not in the way that most people want me to, because my main message that I want to communicate to anybody who wants to write comics is that, in my opinion, in order to write good comics, you have to draw comics, and that even if you are bad. And so I'm going to kind of transition into the final part of this talk, which is thumbnails and simple comics drawing. Because I feel like everybody, especially when you're getting started, but even honestly, if you've been doing it for a while, if you don't normally draw comics, draw your own comic scripts. And this is an example of how I drew my comic scripts when I was making my comic Chronin. I had written the script beforehand. I had a notebook with graph paper in it. I would draw very small versions of the pages, and then I would just number the word balloons that would have any dialogue that was supposed to happen on the page. And what I really want to emphasize here is these are very simple drawings. And I just want to show you a series of thumbnails that some friends of mine sent in to me who are all professional cartoonists, and these are thumbnails for their like professional books, just to show you that like, and this is a part of their process they always do. It is important to them to show that even very simple and quote unquote bad drawings are a big part of helping you understand how a page is going to be laid out. You're making a lot of narrative decisions and a lot of you're making a lot of choices when you draw a comic, even if it's a very simple thumbnail version of it, if it is a very simple stick figure version of it. And so if you want to write comics, I recommend drawing bad, shitty stick figures like this, because you will learn a lot. You will learn so much about what is or isn't working. And also do letter them. Do put all the dialogue in, like actually put it in Photoshop or something like that, or draw it on the page, because you'll be surprised at how little text will fit on a page. But so here's from Meg Brennan. This is from her book Magical Girls. Again, this is a professional cartoonist. This is what her thumbnails look like. I assume most of the people watching this could probably draw something that looks a little bit like this. There's a surprising amount of information packed into these little tiny scribbles. Like if you really think about it, like where people are and like what the camera point of view is, and like what the focus of who the focus of the scene is, and kind of how they're standing next to each other. Like that's all, these are all choices you have to make, and all those choices are in these little shitty drawings. This is from Carrie Peach. Sorry. Yeah, again, like what's the panel layout going to be like? And if you had the script next to you, especially, you'd be able to understand like what exactly is being represented here. But this is like a part of her process. And then finally, Miranda Harmon. These are both very little cleaner than some of the other ones, but extremely simple. These are about, I think, kittens and dogs are the characters in this comic. And again, anybody here could draw something like this, and you will learn more from doing, if you don't draw normally, or you don't draw comics normally, you will learn more from this than you will learn from anything that I have said in this entire talk. Like this stuff this is where you learn comics. And also, if you are working with somebody else, this can be part of it. Like if you do thumbnails like this, it can be helpful for the person that you're working with. If it helps you focus like how you want the page to be laid out and how you want it to look, you can provide that to the person you're working with to help communicate that information to them. So yeah, that is my talk. Here's some of the books that I've made. I hope this was helpful, and this is a little bit of a different approach to this than people usually take. But for me, the important thing about comics writing is just to understand how powerful of a medium comics is, and how many cool things you can do with it, and how big your toolbox is, and then kind of be thinking about that, and also be thinking about it when you're reading comics, because I think that the more you read comics and are thinking about how they work, the emotional reaction you're having to them and why, that'll make you better at writing comics. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but also I know I've been talking for like 40 minutes at this point, so
Well, that's basically what I was going to say, is if anybody has any questions, maybe give it 20 seconds, and then you can then you can answer.
Jerry, do you have any questions as the host for this talk?
I mean, I didn't prepare any questions.
No, I just mean like having listened to me talk for 40 minutes.
Oh, I mean, one of the things, I guess it's not really a question, but I never really thought about like, you had referenced like using color sort of as like equivalent to music in a movie or something.
Mhm.
I had never really thought about that, but that's a really interesting way to think of it. It sort of makes me think of synesthesia, but um but it makes sense because there is no audio medium. So it's like, you kind of have to set the mood somehow.
Yeah.
Um, but like not really being a comics person myself, like it's something I never really thought about, but it makes a ton of sense. And now that I think about it, yeah, I definitely have seen that. So
It's
yeah, I just thought
interesting
that was cool.
because people there's a lot of bad blood with uh comics, like film and television people being dismissive of comics as a medium or treating it like I'm just going to make a comic so it'll get adapted into a film. Um and like not taking it seriously. So some cartoonists can be very resistant to using film language to describe comics, but I do think that because we have, I think, a more robust tradition of film criticism and talking about film, so we have a lot of tools for how to talk about it. I don't think there's any reason to not borrow those terms, especially since a lot of lay people are more familiar with them and they can be very helpful. It's all about like you can, as long as you're respecting the medium you are working in, I think using whatever language feels appropriate to talk about it, as long as you're clearly communicating, like that's the important thing. And I mean that's the big thing with comics, right? Is that like I said also, because it's so collaborative, every stage of it is about communication. Like the writer is communicating first with the editor, and then the script is a communication document with the artist who is then collaborating with the writer to then communicate to the reader in a way that degree of having to like everything has to be clear to a bunch of different people before it gets presented to the reader in like all these different stages is very different than prose. I think it's a lot more of a straight line. Obviously, there's revision and editorial and whatever, but what the writer writes is very directly put in front of the reader in a way that is not true for comics. And it's interesting. You learn a lot also when you start to get pages back from the artist you're working with, and they've clearly misunderstood something. Because I feel like if an artist draws something wrong and they're a professional and like doing their job remotely, usually means the writer screwed up somewhere. And this comes up a lot in nonfiction comics, especially where I'm having to communicate a scientific concept or something that's very technical. Sometimes I'd get pages back from my poor artist that were just like wild, like totally off the mark. But that was really helpful because it was like, oh, I'm clearly not explaining this very well.
Right.
Like I failed. Like I didn't communicate this concept because if I'd communicated this conceptually to you well enough, you would have intuitively understood how to draw it. But I screwed up. So especially things that are like physics things, that there's that kind of like a physical thing is happening and you have to kind of intuitively understand it. You can tell when you've done a bad when you've done a bad job. I either didn't explain it well or I didn't provide enough reference. And so that's just a sign to me that I have to try again. We figure it out at the end. But that's a unique problem for nonfiction, especially.
So we have a
Um,
question here in chat from Eric. I don't know if you saw that.
no, I didn't. If you
Can
can read it
I'm
to me.
assuming you can see it, but so on pages where there's no dialogue, how much information do you give your artist? Moods and words, or is it very detailed?
This is really interesting because I think that different comics writers have very different opinions about this. And I would say you have to write as much as is necessary to communicate what you want on the page. And usually there's a happy medium of like enough specificity that it's clear, but not so much that you're again micromanaging your artist to a really insane degree. So usually for a page with no dialogue, I'll be writing a short paragraph for each of those panels. Um, and sometimes only like a single sentence is necessary if it's something very straightforward, like Grace gasps out loud and her eyes are really wide. Like that's pretty clear. But if it's like if there's more than one character, if there's anything physical happening, like I'll describe that in more detail. If the specifics of where they are in relation to each other, or the specifics of something going on in the background are important, it's kind of like what's important, and am I communicating on the script? Although that does remind me another thing that's very important, and then this is a really important rule of thumb that I always forget that not everybody has heard a million times, which is that when you're writing comics, remember that with very few exceptions, only one thing can happen physically per panel, which sounds really straightforward, but in my capacity as an editor of professional comics writers, you would not believe the degree to which people who have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years still write a panel because they're just in the zone and not thinking about it, where it's like, David leaps up from his chair and runs across the room and slams open the door. I'm like, you can have maybe 2 of those. You cannot have all 3. You might be able to draw leaps from chair and runs across room by like showing the action and like context. You can kind of figure out that he leaped up and is now running across the room. You can show like running across room to slam door. You cannot show leap up from chair, run across room, slam door. That's starting to push it, right? You can't show, and especially if like there's a turn, like there's a mood turn, you can only have 1 emotion per panel is another big thing. So like if the dialogue has a big emotional turn, those have to be 2 separate panels. You can't have somebody be like, you can't have a panel in which somebody's like, so and so was really sad, and then his fiance walked in and he was delighted. Like, those are 2 panels. You can't be really sad that your fiance isn't here and then really excited that he is here in the same panel. Those are 2 different panels. And there are really amazing, brilliant cartoonists who could figure out a way to do that in 1 panel, but those people, they're geniuses and you're not. I'm not. None of us are that genius. That person is exceptional. That person knows who they are. They're operating on a different plane of existence than the rest of us mortals. Normal people, 1 emotion per panel, 1 action per panel, or 2 actions that are continuously part of the same action. It's like boring nuts and bolts stuff, but you'd be shocked how often that comes up and you have to fix it. Yeah, anyway. And yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So you've worked with a couple different artists. Is there like, do you get to pick who you want to work with, or like, does the publisher do that? Do you work before you sell something to a publisher? Like, what's the process there? Like, how does that exactly work?
Hilariously, it's definitely one of those, it depends. I've had all those things happen. I've had books where I have a book right now that is on submission, which means like editors are looking at it, where me and the artist and our agents all work together and we have like sample pages put up and we're working together and we're putting ourselves out there as a unit. Like we are a writer and artist collaboration. We have pre-found each other, like we're friends of friends. You are not like we're a complete package. For Gray State Space and for the Mars Challenge and for Flying Machines, my publisher, well, okay, so for Gray State Space and Flying Machines, my publisher presented 1 or more artists to be like, hey, I think this person might be a good fit. What do you think? And I said, great. And they drew some sample pages and I'm like, these are great. This person's a genius. And it was wonderful. For the Mars Challenge, I suggested some artists that I thought might be a good fit. And one of those people was who they hired. But my editor ultimately was who kind of vetted those choices and decided and negotiated with that artist. And then for really independent stuff, you just do everything yourself. And I've had a couple of those too. It used to be more very inside baseball thing. For a long time, the wisdom, kind of the way that usually worked, is that unless you had a pre-existing relationship with someone, the publisher would prefer to do matchmaking for you. That's what they call it when you, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. Because the publisher knows a lot of cartoonists. They already have people on their Rolodex who they want to work with. They have pre-existing relationships. They have a clear idea about like what the marketing or like the sales landscape of this book is going to be and who is going to be a good fit for that. So they would rather you leave that to the professionals. But these days, for a variety of reasons, we're moving back toward the publisher wanting for you to figure that out on your own and then come to them when you've sorted that out, especially if you're not like Neil Gaiman. Like if you're just one of us schmucks, some randos in the middle, they want you to figure that out for yourself. Most of us are randos. That isn't being dismissive of me or anybody else. There's the big guys, there's the hasn't been published yet, and then there's a vast sea of schmucks in the middle. And that's most of us, and that's fine. Gonna make a living.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Ruler?
All right. I guess my kind of closing thing here would be that the other big question I get from people all the time is how I break into comics. And my really horrible but completely sincere, both from my own experience and from the bottom of my heart, answer is to just make comics. Make comics and share them with people, and that's how you get into comics. And follow the opportunities that come to you, respect the connections that are presented to you, build community with other people who are also making and sharing comics, be a good citizen of that community, get better at your craft when appropriate, look for people who can help you, like, submit to agents and whatever. But when you're getting started, it really is just like make comics, put them out there, meet other people, be nice to those people, be respectful of the work that they're making, give people feedback, like positive feedback on stuff that they're making, and just be a good member of the community. All creative industries are communities, but comics especially, it's very small. And most of us got where we are because of looking out for each other. Which sounds sappy, but it's true. That literally that is true. It both will make your life more pleasant and will also make your career better. So it's kind of a win-win right there. So yeah.
Thanks
To
again,
anybody,
Ben. We
yeah,
appreciate it.
anybody watching this now or later in the future, I hope this was helpful. And thank you so much to the library and to you specifically, Jerry, for hosting me. This is fun. I love to talk about comics. It's my whole
Well, maybe
job and I
we'll
do
have
it
you
all the
back.
time, but
All right. Well, thanks again.